Hi, and welcome back to my unhinged recap of Desperate Housewives. Today we cover season 7. Thank you all for your patience with me with getting this one out. I was set on filming this last Friday, but I did a background gig on Thursday, and it ended up being an overnight shoot, and so I didn't get home till 9 a.m. And on the train home, I was thinking, I can do this. I'll get home, I'll set up my little lights, I'll wash the hairspray out of my hair, and then we'll do it. And y'all, I was so tired. I couldn't. Anyway, I recently hit 1,000 subscribers, which is super cool, and I'm very excited, and thank you so much for that. I also want to thank Eileen, Lisa, Josh, and Cyber Angel for supporting me via Ko-fi or the super comments down below since my last video. Thank you so much for that. I'm very excited to keep putting out videos for you. I have a very tentative schedule in my most recent community post. Hopefully by my birthday, I will have posted another handful of videos, and we'll see what the summer brings. I'm super glad you're here, and thanks for sticking with me through this series so far. As you can see, the wall is all put together for season 7. I'll move it out of the way so you can just really take it in. The more stuff I add, the more it just falls apart in front of my eyes every time I walk by. I still love my little shapes for things. As you can see, we have a new one here. Of course, I'll explain what this is when we get there, but I do want to say that for season 8, I'm going to shake things up just a tiny bit. In season 8, we kind of explore some different territory in terms of genre, so it's not so much mystery, but leaning towards domestic thriller in some ways. The way that I approach the wall will have to change in order to have a lot of the plots represented, which are very important to the show. They don't really necessarily connect one character to another, but a bunch of characters to a central plot. So we have this beautiful space in the middle for that, and it just worked out perfectly. I cut out these little trees, and I was like, God damn. Anything else? This month, I also watched Melrose Place. I watched the first 5 seasons, and it was a wild fucking ride. If you like Desperate Housewives and the soapy elements of it, you should watch Melrose Place. Marsha Cross. I have never seen anyone girl boss closer to the sun. Okay, without further ado, let's get into season 7. Season 7, episode 1. You may recall, at the end of the previous season, we saw a nurse make a deathbed confession that she had switched 2 babies at birth at the hospital where most of the Wisteria Lane children were born. This baby turns out to be Juanita Solis. Yes, the daughter of Carlos and Gabby Solis, named after Carlos's mother, Juanita Solis. Carlos now knows about the switch, but Gabby does not. Carlos gives the hospital 2 options. 1, he will sue them, or 2, they can shred the documents and all evidence that this ever happened so that Gabby will never find out. Likely because he wants to protect his family and keep things the way that they are. Additionally, in this episode, we start to get some of the aftermath of Gabby being told by Brie Vandekamp that Andrew was the one who hit Juanita Solis Sr. with a car when he was drunk. Gabby tells Brie she does not plan to tell Carlos about this. So, Gabby and Carlos keep in secrets from each other. In this episode, Brie is beginning to figure out what she wants to do with her life now that she no longer has her company. Remember, she gave up her company to her late husband's son in order for him not to go to the police about Andrew hitting Juanita Solis Sr. with the car. She notices some wallpaper peeling in her house and decides what she needs is a good project. So she hires a handyman named Keith to help her refinish her house. Here is Keith. Orson also stops by to get the final signature on the divorce papers. That will finish the final division of assets, and their divorce will be final, and Brie is a free woman, and it turns out Orson is dating the woman who became his nurse. The Delfinos move into their new little apartment. Once again, you may recall at the end of last season, they decided to rent out their house and move somewhere smaller so they could save up some money to pay off the debt that they owe. Susan's landlord sees that she is in need of money and tries to recruit her to a website called Vava Broom, which is a live cam site where women clean things while wearing lingerie. The woman makes it very clear to Susan, and really the writers of Desperate Housewives are making it clear to the network, who in turn is making it clear to viewers. Susan will not necessarily be doing anything sexual, nor will she be taking off her clothes, but she is wearing lingerie, so it is pretty clear that this website is either a type of sex work or sex work adjacent, depending on how you wish to define that. Mike suggests that he take a job on an oil rig in Alaska. Taking this job in Alaska and being away from home for a while would be enough to pay off their debts and they could move back into their old house. But Susan does not want Mike to go, so she decides to take her landlord up on this job. We will unpack this more in the coming episodes. Let's move on. For now, let's move on. We then see an event that occurs prior to the very end of season 6. Felicia Tillman, who a few seasons ago faked her own death and moved to the middle of nowhere to start her life over and leave Paul framed for her murder, gets pulled over for speeding. The cops discover that she is Felicia Tillman, that she is still alive, meaning Paul did not murder her, and thus Paul is a free man. Felicia, in turn, is arrested for framing Paul for her murder, which never really happened, and Mrs. McCluskey begins telling the neighborhood that Paul is out of prison. Paul visits Felicia in jail, and she vows to put him back behind bars for good. Meanwhile, Paul is cooking up some sort of master plan. He wants to buy his old house back, and we're not quite sure what he's planning, but it's something presumably devious because this is, after all, Desperate Housewives. And speaking of desperate, Felicia tells her prison cellmate that Paul will be dead within 6 months. And last, but certainly not least, we are introduced to the final of the main housewives we will see on the show. She is a college friend of Lynette's, and she is coming into town for a little visit. Her name is Renee Perry, and she is played by the incomparable Vanessa Williams. Mother alert. Renee is a rich girl whose husband plays for the Yankees. She lives in New York City. She's bitchy. She has money. She hates kids. Lynette is thrilled to see her because the two were absolute best friends in college. It seems they've stayed in touch over the years. However, when Renee is visiting and she and Lynette are catching up, she implies that Lynette isn't successful because she left her career to raise kids instead. Turns out that Renee is really just projecting her own insecurities, and she reveals to Lynette that her husband, Doug, is leaving her. Presumably, that's why she has come to Wisteria Lane. She knew her marriage was about to end, and she needed a friend, and that friend happened to be Lynette. Especially now that I've watched Melrose Place, I see what a soap trope it is to bring the old friend into town. But it's kind of fun, and we get a little more soapy with her with a few little things as the season progresses. But I won't get too ahead of myself. Just want to say once again, welcome to Wisteria Lane, Renee Perry. Season 7, Episode 2. Gabby finds out at the hospital that Juanita has type A blood, but she and Carlos have type O blood. This means that Juanita cannot be Gabby's biological child. This revelation leads Carlos to finally tell Gabby the truth that Juanita was switched at birth with another baby at the hospital. In the Scavo household, Tom has been struggling a little bit recently, and after visiting the doctor, it turns out he has postpartum depression. Lynette laughs him off about this, kind of tells him to man up, and I have to say, for once in my life, I think I might be on Tom's side. Tom and Lynette bicker, and Renee offers Tom some emotional support. This upsets Lynette, who then goes to Renee to confront her about offering support to her husband. And Renee warns Lynette that based on the way that her and Tom were bickering, it sounds like their marriage might be in danger. Tom and Renee go out to dinner together just to chat and catch up, and Lynette joins them. And once again, she's upset at Renee for meddling in her marriage. Lynette does decide to read the pamphlet that Tom brought home on postpartum depression, and she tells him that she thinks she understands and wants to support him going forward. Thank God. With Renee's marriage ending, she is looking for a new permanent home, so she decides to move into Edie Britt's old house. Hold that thought. Tom says it's not a good idea for her to move in on the street because Lynette can never know about what happened between them. If you have not been stressed out by the Scavo so far in the series, then this is where it all begins, okay? Let me tell you, I don't think we're going to get a moment of rest now until... I won't tell you when because I don't want to spoil it, but just know we are in it for the long haul now. Now on to the thought I was holding. Renee not only moving onto the lane and like being added to the show, more specifically moving into Edie Britt's old house is iconic. Renee will go on to contribute a lot of the same spirit that Edie contributed to the show. I think they realized after season 6 they kind of need an Edie-esque character. That is not to say that Renee is too similar to Edie or that Renee is not unique on her own. What I mean is we need the single, childless, bitchy, slutty character. We needed a woman who was single. We needed a woman without kids. We needed someone who's just kind of a girl's girl and is going to help the woman with the same things Edie did, like sex and relationships, and also serve as good comic relief, because this season the mystery will not revolve around the new member of the Lane like it did last season, or like one of the mysteries did last season. I hope that makes sense. Vanessa Williams is a brilliant addition to the cast and really revitalized the show in a lot of ways, especially the main core group of women. This is kind of the first time since the introduction of Catherine that a new woman has come onto the Lane and shifted the dynamic of the ensemble. I would argue that attaching Edie to Dave for all of season 5 and then writing her off the show completely changed the dynamic of the group of women as a whole, and so having another woman to shake it up again is wonderful. Vanessa Williams is hilarious, talented, brilliant, show-stopping, amazing, spectacular, never before done. You might remember I mentioned Vanessa Williams during my season 2 video when I said that she stopped watching the show due to the underlying racism of the Applewhite plotline. And coincidentally, this is the first Black woman to be added to the cast since the Applewhites in season 2. Like, it really took them a whole 5 years for that one. Everyone say hi to Renee in the comments. We are so excited that she is here. I will start a little thread. Okay, will be the Renee housewarming thread in the comment section. We will all say hi, Renee, share some gossip if you want. While Keith continues to work on the Vandekamp home, Bree begins to realize that she has some urges. She's so distracted by her feelings and lust for him that, in fact, she runs over Juanita Solis as she's backing out of her driveway. Juanita is uninjured. She falls off her bike, but she's okay. And Gabby is like, "How does your family keep doing this to us? I'll give you my mother-in-law because I don't like her, but my daughter is off limits." Bree doesn't know how to deal with her sexual urges, so she decides to fire Keith. But then Mrs. McCluskey gives her a little pep talk, tells her it's okay to feel how she's feeling, and encourages Bree to hire him back. So Bree goes and begs for him to return, and he reluctantly agrees. Susan does her first Vava Broom live stream and feels a little self-conscious during it, but is slowly starting to get the hang of it. It might be hard to imagine what I'm talking about if you haven't seen these scenes, but she is literally in lingerie, vacuuming. It's so funny because we have seen Susan a few times in lingerie throughout the show. I think there was like twice in season 1 and then maybe 1 or 2 times since then. It's almost like Terry Hatcher went up to the producers and said, "Hey, so Marcia got to show a lot of cleavage this season. I would like a turn." But I don't know. And finally, a new woman comes to Wisteria Lane, and it turns out to be Beth, who is Paul's new wife. They met when he was in prison, and they wrote letters back and forth, and she really liked him then, but she doesn't really seem to like being married to him. This is Beth, by the way. Beth tells Paul she's not ready to consummate their relationship yet. She wants to take her time, and also she keeps mentioning Mama. And so, like, there's something going on about her mother or something. It's just really bizarre. I did not remember this plot when I watched the show, and so me and my roommate were both like, what the hell happened to this woman? What is her lore? Paul begins to grow impatient with Beth, however, and guilts her into agreeing to have sex with him sometime in the near future. Season 7, Episode 3. Carlos and Gabby sign a document promising they will not sue the hospital if the hospital calls off the search for the other family. However, Gabby then changes her mind and decides she does want to seek out the other family, so she hires Bob to help her. She has a few more details now about the other family, and it doesn't take long for Bob to track them down. Gabby then asks Bob to give them a call and tell them about what's going on. There's a really sweet moment in this episode between Gabby and Juanita tells Gabby that she never wants to get married because she wants to live with Mommy and Daddy forever. Bob tells Carlos that the call did not go very well and things got pretty intense on the phone with the other family. Carlos then freaks out at Gabby for starting this whole thing in the first place, and they begin to worry that what if the other family decides that they want Juanita and they lose their daughter. In the Scavo household, Tom is still struggling with his depression, so he goes to the doctor again and is given an antidepressant. Lynette doesn't want him taking any medication, and so she encourages him to go see a different doctor instead. This new doctor gives him a prescription for medical marijuana, which Lynette is also not happy about, so she replaces it with oregano. Tom proceeds to smoke, and he's feeling pretty good, and then he asks Carlos if he wants to smoke with him, and so they're sharing a joint, and Carlos is like, Tom, this is oregano. And so Tom goes and confronts Lynette about it, and Lynette apologizes and he forgives her. And that's that. And these 2 episodes, I was kind of in disbelief. Characters are going to do stupid things, but Lynette just really pissed me off in these 2 episodes. I'm sure that like her underlying reason for doing these things is just that she doesn't like the idea that Tom is unhappy and that like she can't do anything about it, right? But like at the same time, she could support him. So it turns out Renee also thinks Keith is super hot. So she gets him to go over to her house, and they are likely, about to do it when Bree decides to sabotage by destroying the sprinklers in her front lawn so that she can call him and say there's an emergency. So when Keith comes running over, Bree is in this gown and her tits are just like fully out, and Keith agrees to go on a date with her. In a lot of ways, this plot is really reminiscent of the pilot when Susan and Edie are in a love triangle with Mike, and Susan decides to stuff some popsicle sticks down her drain so that Mike will come over. So I guess all we need now is to burn Renee's house down. Susan is starting to get the hang of her web shows, but she ends up having a little cat fight with another woman in the company because apparently Susan has stolen one of her bits that she does. As far as we know, it was an accident because Susan doesn't really research and watch the other women's shows. So Susan gets back at her by sabotaging one of her web shows. There's a lot to think about with this whole Vava Broom plot, and I'm certainly curious to hear what you guys think about it. But to me, if I had to pick one thing that was like most dubious about it, it would be that the woman who recruited Susan is her landlord, and this landlord appears to recruit a bunch of the women who live in the apartment building. If it had just been another tenant or something, it wouldn't be as weird. In my opinion, the episodes as written don't appear to show it as weird or anything. Maybe the writers assumed that both the network and viewers would be most concerned about Susan's doing this in the first place as opposed to who introduced her to the idea. She is doing it because it is the best way to get her house back. And so that is made very clear. So there is almost some interesting commentary on the way women may feel pressured to pursue various types of work because of financial situations. But they went the route of Susan having a cat fight with this woman instead of anything like exploring the ethics of the woman who runs the company and recruits these women, or including something to encourage the audience to consider different types of labor ethics in various types of work, regardless of what Susan's current job is. It's also harder to say from the current year where we live because the landscape of sex work online has changed drastically since Desperate Housewives first aired. There have been a few depictions of sex work on Desperate Housewives over the years, usually strippers, Andrew, who quote-unquote was doing things he wasn't proud of for money, and of course Robin. There's also the stripper who Gabby almost adopted a baby from in season 2, I think. I mentioned the landscape of the time, and maybe the decision to have Susan pursue this as her only option to save her family was enough for audiences to pick up on some kind of critique. I'm certainly curious to hear about what you think. I feel like because they went in such a lighthearted route for most of this plot that I can't make a super strong argument one way or another what the show is really trying to say. I imagine that the inclusion of Robin in the previous season was something that they kind of tested the waters with, and thus the writer's room / the network felt like this plotline would be well received. So the question really becomes, did they include all of the stuff about how it's Susan's only option to save her family to justify including this plot for the viewers? Or did they include all that stuff as a critique of or commentary on the job itself? Maybe both. I don't know. I'm open to hearing what you guys think. Moving on. The girls want the gossip on the Paul situation, so Bree, Lynette, and Susan invite Beth to join their weekly poker game. The weekly poker game, by the way, is something we have seen since season 1, so it's really exciting that we're actually going to get to see it again. At the weekly poker game, Beth decides to ask Mrs. McCluskey why everyone hates her, and McCluskey tells her everyone thinks that Paul killed Martha Huber. Season 7, episode 4. The Solises meet their biological daughter Grace, as well as Grace's parents, Hector and Carmen. Here is Grace, and Hector and Carmen. Grace is a lot like Gabby was when she was her age, and it's pretty clear that Carmen doesn't really like Gabby. She thinks that she is spoiled and rich, and Gabby's kind of acting that way around them. Her insecurities are really coming out, and she's definitely put up all of her defenses. In this episode, Gabby decides to tell her friends about Juanita and Grace being switched at birth. She also explains that she knows what it's like to be that kid, so she decides to buy her a starter Chanel. When she stops by to give Carmen the purse to give to Grace, Carmen refuses to take it, although Gabby wants Grace to have nice things. 1, it's not her place to decide how Grace is raised. 2, it insults Carmen and Hector for not having the money that Gabby and Carlos have, and sheds a light and a contrast between the two parents, which isn't as important as loving their kids. And this is highlighted when the two families get together at the Solis house. Hector and Carlos hang out, they're getting along fine. Meanwhile, Carmen is teaching Juanita how to make tortillas. During this, she gives Juanita a kiss on the cheek, and that upsets Gabby. And Gabby decides to, I wouldn't say retaliate, but again, her defenses go up. So she decides to give Grace a tour of the house. She gives her a nice necklace from her jewelry box and makes Grace promise to keep it a secret. Let's talk about the Scavos. Penny is growing up, so she's like 9 or 10, 11? You know, she's able to watch and help take care of Paige, the youngest Scavo, a little bit more. Lynette decides to go out for a jog in the morning, and she's gone a little too long, so Penny can't wait and miss the bus, so she just takes Penny on the bus with her. This gets Penny in trouble at school, and Penny has to talk to the principal. What we see is Lynette finding out from the principal that Penny told her she takes the baby monitor with her to bed at night so that she can wake up and be the one to feed Paige so that her parents don't have to worry about it. Because the more her mom wakes up in the middle of the night, the crankier she is the next day, and she wants her mom to be in a good mood. As a result of doing this, however, her grades are really starting to slip. Once at home, Penny apologizes to Lynette for taking the baby to school, and Lynette explains that she's not mad at her. She didn't do anything wrong. Lynette is the one who messed up. Penny explains here the reason she took the baby monitor to bed, which was so that Lynette would be in a good mood because she likes that mommy better, and Lynette tells her that it's not her job to take care of her mom. Besides it just being really funny to see Penny on the bus with the little baby, I love this plot. I think it is such a good contrast to the previous seasons, scene between Tom and Roy. Between Tom and Roy about why Lynette is a quote-unquote control freak. Just Lynette telling Penny it is not her responsibility to take care of her shows that Lynette is trying to break this cycle that she grew up in. And despite my annoyance with Lynette from the last few episodes, I think this scene shows a lot of growth from her. All that said and done, Lynette tells Tom that she needs a nanny. The Bree and Renee rivalry for Keith continues in this episode. When Renee finds out that Bree is a grandmother, she makes sure that Keith also finds out that Bree is a grandmother. Keith comes over with Black Eyed Peas tickets, and he's not really sure if Bree will want to go with him. But she's like, I'm not as old as you think. And then ding dong, and then her grandson runs in and says, Grandma! Danielle has come into town with her son and explains that Renee called her because Bree has been really struggling since Orson left. I think it's actually kind of amazing that Danielle actually showed up because her mom was in need. Like, can we talk about that? Also, Andrew lives on the fucking street. Why did she not call up her brother and say, hey, is mom okay? Bree then talks to Lynette about what she could do to get back at Renee. Lynette reveals that Renee has a fear of little people, therefore, they will send a little person to Renee and Keith's dinner to scare her so she'll make an ass out of herself and get Keith to lose interest in her. I think Renee respects the lengths that Bree went to, and she decides to call off their fight, saying that she'd rather have Bree as a friend than an enemy. So, Va Broom is expanding. It is going international and will be coming to America soon. Maxine, who is Susan's boss and landlord, warns her about this so that Susan has time to get off the website while she still can before it becomes public in America. But then a Va Broom billboard goes up with Susan's face on it. Susan's boss is unable to get the campaign taken down because it costs $9,000 to do the whole thing. So Susan goes and rips the thing down herself. And then we see a man taking it out of the trash and walking away with it. And finally, Paul buys his old house back despite currently renting out Susan's home, and this confuses Beth. Paul visits the house and explains that he had a real marriage there. Beth's response is that she doesn't like having any secrets between them, sort of a counter to having a real marriage. It's also interesting because there's clearly some kinds of secrets going on in this marriage, even if it's just as simple as the Martha Huber thing. Whereas in season 1, the Paul and Mary Alice marriage, they were in on everything together concerning Zach and Deirdre. Even if Mary Alice was the one responsible for the murder of Deirdre, Paul Young helped her cover it up and was a part of her secrets all the time. So the two had a united front as a couple. Anyway, Paul asks Karen McCluskey if she has any interest in selling her home, and she says no. And Paul says, okay, you're happy here for now, but one day you will fall and break your hip or have a stroke, and future buyers might not care about you as much as I do. Is that a fucking threat? As Paul continues to attempt to acquire homes on Wisteria Lane, Beth grows more and more suspicious of what he's up to. Season 7, Episode 5, we're going to start out with the Scavos. So Tom's mother comes into town to be their nanny. His mother, Allison, is a little bit overbearing, and she also shows a sign or two of forgetfulness, which is kind of like when a woman in a film or play set during the Victorian period coughs a little in Act 1. Allison is being a little weird about Penny, making Penny wait on the boys and really nailing in the gender roles that Penny and Lynette should be the providers and she should be the provider, and then the boys should just get to do whatever the fuck they want. So Lynette snaps at her, and then Tom is mad at Lynette for doing so and is like, you always have to make the calls in the house. How many times are we going to end up back here? How many times do we have to go over this? Anyways, Allison and Lynette have a heart-to-heart. Allison explains that she doesn't understand why Lynette would want to go back to work when it is such a joy to have a family. And Lynette says it's just the way she is. Later, Penny walks into the kitchen when Allison is sitting in there, and Allison asks who she is and if she lives there. I'm telling ya, cough, cough, the signs were there. So it's clear that Allison has some sort of dementia or memory issues. Renee's divorce settlement comes through and she is now absolutely loaded. She and Gabby hang out and they are getting along really well. And then Doug shows up in Wisteria Lane and decides to ask Renee for forgiveness. Renee shows up to hang out with the girls and shows off her new ring that Doug got her and explains that she's rethinking her divorce. As the women start to challenge her a little bit on this, Renee reveals to everyone that Gabby had a nose job. And that is something that Gabby told Renee in complete confidence. There's an iconic line in this episode, which is, "You once called your face proof of God's existence." Anyway, to get back at Renee for revealing the truth about her nose job, Gabby reveals to Doug that Renee slept with her divorce attorney, which is something that Renee told her in confidence when the two of them were chatting. Doug suggests to Renee the next day that they just call it even. They both slept with another person. He won't hold the sleeping with the divorce attorney over her if she can forgive him for sleeping with someone else. Later, Renee tells Gabby that she decided to turn Doug down and go through with the divorce. And she tells her that it took a real friend to have the courage to tell her something like that and actually tell her the truth. So Bree takes Keith out to a fancy French restaurant, and then they have crazy sex for 6 hours. Bree is exhausted by Keith's sexual appetite, and she's starting to become insecure that maybe she won't be able to keep up with him. So she starts making all these really overwhelming demands with the construction work that he's doing on her house, hoping to physically exhaust him so that he won't have the energy to have all the sex with her that she is just too old and tired for. They do eventually communicate though, and it turns out that Keith thinks that sex is all he has to offer Bree, so he just keeps offering her sex. Paul offers to buy Susan and Mike's house, but they say they're not interested. Paul tells Lee that he has some other plans though. So one way or another, he is absolutely determined to purchase the Meyer Delfino house. Meanwhile, Susan wants to make a little bit more money because she wants to get back in her house as soon as possible now that the threat of Paul is kind of on her back. So she starts doing private sessions with clients. After one client asks her for more than she is willing to give him, however, she kind of blows it with him and she gets fired from her job. Susan is devastated to have lost the income for her family, and when Lynette asks her what's wrong, Susan tells her the truth. And Lynette freaks out at first, but then she becomes very understanding, and she knows that judging Susan's decision is not actually what a good friend would do, and Susan just needs her support at a time like this. Luckily, Maxine offers Susan her job back on the condition that she do a private show for someone who specifically requested Susan. Who is the man? Could it be the one who stole the Va-Va Broom poster from the dumpster? Well, Susan logs on to do the video chat, and it is none other than Paul Young. In this call, he threatens her, saying, "A lot of things are for sale. Your body, your reputation. Your house seems to be the smallest of these things," essentially blackmailing Susan into selling him her house. Otherwise, he will tell everyone about her work on Va-Va Broom and therefore ruin her reputation, maybe her family, etc. Mary Alice's voiceover tells us at the end of the episode that Paul has a plan to turn his neighbors against one another because that is the best way to punish them for what they did to him. Season 7, Episode 6. This is the Halloween episode of the season. During a playdate, Juanita sees that Grace is wearing a necklace that she knows belongs to Gabby, so Juanita assumes that Grace stole the necklace. When Juanita tells Gabby about it, Gabby tells Juanita that she gave Grace the necklace because she feels sorry for her. For Halloween, Juanita is going as a puppy, and by the way, she looks absolutely adorable. But Grace, meanwhile, is going as a beautiful princess. So Juanita starts to get a little jealous of her. At one point, the crown gets tangled in her hair, and Juanita decides to cut some of her hair off because it's the only way to get the crown off. So Juanita is clearly developing some animosity towards Grace, which is kind of understandable because she does not know about the situation. 2, she's like 8. And Juanita tells Gabby that she's not the one who cares about spending time with Grace. It's Gabby who cares. Juanita does not give a single fuck about Grace. She doesn't know this girl. They're not friends. Tom's mom is continuing to show concerning signs of dementia, so Lynette decides to tell Tom about it. Tom doesn't quite believe her, and the next morning he speaks to his mother, who seems to be completely fine. So he tells Lynette that it seems like she is just looking for a reason to make Allison leave, since they had the whole disagreement about whether women should be in the home or at work. That night, Halloween, Allison tells him that she's going out to get some more candy, but she ends up getting lost in the neighborhood. Carlos calls Lynette to tell her where Allison is, and she goes and picks her up. Allison immediately blames Lynette for this evening's stressful and scary and confusing events happening, and she slaps Lynette. Tom is overlooking them and sees their argument and the slap and realizes that something really is wrong with his mom. He tells her that it's okay and that he's here for her, and then Tom, along with his siblings, decide that they're going to get her into assisted care. Renee is the one to throw the big Halloween fest on the lane. She has a big party, very glamorous, and there are no children allowed. Renee dresses as Marilyn Monroe, and when Keith arrives with Bree, he asks who she's dressed as, and she starts singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," and Keith goes, "Michelle Obama? Cool." And then Lee arrives, and he is also dressed like Marilyn Monroe in the 7-Year Itch. Bree gets to see Keith's apartment for the first time, and while she's there, she notices a letter addressed to him from the Eagle State Department of Corrections. Renee discovers from a bartender that Keith is on probation because he punched a guy when he was defending his girlfriend in a fight. At the party, Keith becomes upset when a man is being very persistent and aggressive towards Bree, and Bree takes him outside. Keith apologizes, and the two of them discuss their baggage, with Bree even revealing to Keith that she is an alcoholic. This is a pretty significant step forward for Bree because in the relationship with Carl, it was kind of all about sex. Of course, Bree in the past, just having sex with someone outside of marriage is like a huge thing. You know, if you were to tell season 1 Bree that would happen, she would not believe you, right? But even more so, I think, is making herself vulnerable, because also in the pilot episode, we see Bree crying quietly to herself for 5 minutes in the bathroom of the hospital. And then when she comes out, she's put together, right? So any sign of vulnerability that Bree is willing to show Keith really shows how much faith she has in this relationship and how much Bree has grown from season 1. Over to Susan and Mike. Because of the blackmail from Paul, Susan is kind of forced to tell Mike about Va-Va Broom because he still has no idea that this is what she's been doing for money. He thinks she's just been selling jewelry she makes. Mike is very patient with her about the whole thing. He's just upset with himself for not taking that job in Alaska. Susan is super determined to keep her house though and not let this blackmail affect their family. So she goes over to her home, which Paul is renting, and looks for any technicality that can prove that Paul broke a lease. She finds something silly like he hung up a picture on the wall using a nail, and therefore finds that she can evict him, and she tells him that he has 60 days to leave the premises. She also tells him that Mike now knows about the blackmail and that Mike would not have been as kind as her In fact, Mike wanted to smash his head in with a hammer. Paul tells a mom at the school where Susan is still an assistant art teacher about her job on Vava Broom. She's called into the principal's office and therefore fired. And this is the final straw for Mike, who realizes he really needs to accept that job in Alaska and thus will be gone for a few months. Since this is something that seems like it would tear the family apart, I'm thinking like he's probably going to be gone for a year, right? 8 months, 9 months. It's a long time. Viewer, the job is a 3-month contract. You are goddamn right you're going to take that job in Alaska. I'm sorry, but this is 12 weeks we're talking. I don't know why it is so dramatic. So Susan went through all this shit so that Mike wouldn't have to go to Alaska for 3 months. Okay, on to Paul. Paul is frustrated that after 2 months of living together, Beth will still not consummate their marriage. The pair of them go to couples counseling together, where Beth confesses that she's a virgin and she's really not sure if she will like sex. And that's part of the reason why she is so nervous to do it with Paul. The counselor suggests they slow down and just try dating, since the way they got to know each other was very unconventional, with Paul being in prison. Maybe they should just try courting for a little while. So their first date will be a Halloween event at the Oak Ridge School where Susan teaches, and that is where Paul tells a mom about Susan. Paul tells Beth that yes, he wants to sleep with her, but what he really wants is just a partner by his side. And then he kind of forcefully kisses her and Beth slaps him, and Paul tells Beth that he wants her out by the end of the week. He also asks Lee once again if Susan will sell her house to him. And on Halloween, newly fired from her job, Susan comes over and starts breaking shit with a bat. I actually really enjoy the scene. It's a Susan W, rare Susan dub. During this physical altercation, Beth comes downstairs with a gun and tells Susan to leave. This show of partnership is so hot to both Beth and Paul that they end up making out. Season 7, Episode 7. Lee becomes jealous because he hears that Paul is hanging out with someone. Turns out the guy he's spending a bunch of time with is actually Carlos. So Lee tells Gabby that he's a little nervous about this. Bob has actually had a crush on Carlos since forever. Bob and Carlos are planning to go on a camping trip together, and Lee knows what happens when two men and one of them is gay and has a crush on the other goes on a camping trip together, so they have to stop the camping trip from happening before Bob can seduce Carlos. Bob and Carlos end up canceling the trip, and Bob talks to Gabby about it, to which he explains that he just needs a friend, and Carlos is a great guy, and they actually have a lot in common, so that's why they've been hanging out. He never had any kind of agenda. So Gabby brings Lee over, and Bob and Lee decide that maybe they will go on the trip together instead, because it might be time for the two of them to patch things up. Love my dads. In this episode, Lynette and Renee decide that they will go into business together. They're going to open an interior design company, and Renee will do the artistic stuff and Lynette will do the business stuff. Now, because Susan is looking for a job and also she's an artist, she tries to find a job within the company, and Renee's like, yeah, we'll hire you. Well, it turns out they hire her to be Paige's nanny, and at one point Renee is kind of rude to Susan and is like, well, you're just the nanny. So this begins to create some tension between Susan and Lynette. Bree rollerblades in this episode, and I love it. She also has her first hot flash. When she goes to a gynecologist, the doctor confirms to her that she is beginning menopause. Bree explains to the woman that she has a hot young boyfriend with a healthy sexual appetite, and she needs some help managing her symptoms so that she can continue to pursue the sexual relationship. Later on, Bree is going to meet Keith's parents for the first time when the four of them will have dinner together. Well, it turns out that Bree's gynecologist is Keith's mother. She tells Keith that Bree is menopausal. After dinner, Bree tells Keith that she's always known that there is some kind of expiration date on the relationship. She really hopes it isn't this. It's too soon for the two of them to even talk about having kids together or anything, but now Bree knows that she's run out of time, and so it might just not happen for the two of them, but Keith really does want kids. Someone to toss around a baseball with and be a dad. So the future of the relationship is put into question. We get confirmation in this episode that Beth and Paul have consummated their marriage. Paul's cellmate from prison stops by, and he and Paul are doing some kind of work on the house, and Beth can't figure out what it is, and it's really mysterious, and no one will tell her. So she blackmails Paul's friend into telling her what's going on. We also see Beth talking to her mother on the phone, and explaining that Paul is trying to buy all these houses on the lane, but she's not sure why. Later, Beth tells Paul that she knows what she's up to because his friend ratted him out. And Beth tells him that she understands vengeance completely. Okay, so Beth does have some lore. We still don't know what it is, and we also don't know what Paul's up to, just that it's vengeful. And finally, Beth goes to report to her mother what Paul is up to. Her mother? None other than Felicia Tillman. I gasped. I was stunned. I did not remember this at all. What a fucking twist. I love this season. Season 7, episode 8. So Carlos invites the Sanchez's over for Thanksgiving dinner and is preparing dinner for them, but they still need to go pick up the Thanksgiving pie. So Hector and Gabby go out to get said pie together at the bakery, and there's a lot of traffic. So Gabby's like, Hector, just drive on the shoulder. And he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And she's like, yes, do it, because I want to get home. So Hector drives on the shoulder. They get pulled over, and he's asked for his license, and he can't provide one. And this is when it is revealed to us and to Gabby that the Sanchez family is here undocumented. Hector is arrested, and Carmen leaves the Thanksgiving dinner in tears with Grace, saying they need to go back and live with their family in Texas so that they don't get deported. Carlos quickly seeks legal counsel from Bob, who tells him that it's too late for Hector and he's going to be deported, but Grace might be able to stay because she was born here, so she's a citizen. And Gabby's reaction to this tells us that she might try to find a way to get Grace to stay with them. I hate this whole thing. I want so badly for Gabby just to not be selfish anymore. So Renee invites Lynette over for Thanksgiving dinner. Since Mike is away, Lynette wants Susan to also join them, so Renee sets up a kids' table outside on the driveway where all the kids can eat together. During the Thanksgiving dinner, Lynette goes home to check on Paige, who is with the boys, and she ends up being there a while, so Tom and Renee have a glass of wine together. Renee reflects on her former marriage with Tom and explains that she just chose the wrong guy, and Lynette doesn't have that problem. Bree hosts Thanksgiving dinner for herself and Keith, Keith's parents, and Mrs. McCluskey and Roy. The dinner quickly becomes a mess when Keith's parents announce that they are going to get a divorce. Keith also has a ring, which makes Bree suspect that Keith might be planning to propose sometime soon to her. Bree tells him that she still believes in marriage if it's with the right person. And maybe it will happen again for her, so she's open to the idea of it. At Keith's apartment later, Keith's father ends up flirting with Bree, and I, for the longest time, could not figure out where I knew this actor from, and it turns out he plays Felicity's father in Felicity, an American Girl Adventure. So, there you have it. Felicia Tillman still wants proof that Paul killed Martha Hooper. That is the way that she will get her revenge and get him locked up for good. So she and Beth are discussing how to do this. And Beth reveals to her mother that she slept with Paul. And Felicia is not very happy about this because we begin to see that maybe Beth really is falling for Paul, actually. So I kind of began wondering, is Felicia Tillman going to have to punish both of them? Anyways, after sex one night, Paul and Beth discuss Martha Hooper. He tells her that Felicia Tillman is crazy, and everyone knows it. He details some of the things she did in order to frame him, and Beth begins to think maybe he's right, and Felicia Tillman is going too far with this. During Thanksgiving dinner, Beth decides to open up to Paul about a time she had a boy over and her mother freaked out. I just want to note, Paul still does not know that Beth's mother is Felicia Tillman. Anyways, when she was a girl, Beth invited this boy over for dinner, and her mother refused to even let her open the door for the boy. Paul says that it sounds like her mother is a very unhappy woman. When Beth visits Felicia in prison again, she asks if she's ever considered the possibility that Paul did not kill Martha Hooper, because Paul swears he didn't do it. Felicia tells Beth that she should leave Paul that day, but Beth refuses, saying that Paul is her husband and that he's really good to her. Felicia responds with, "I didn't raise you to be this stupid. I will not allow you to fall in love with a monster." Season 7, Episode 9, Gabby officially offers to take Grace in, and Carmen is like, no. Gabby then asks Bob, hypothetically, what would happen if, hypothetically, someone were to call and report Carmen to immigration. She then calls a non-emergency number and asks for the number of immigration. They show up at the house, and Grace begins to sob and hug her mother, and this is when Gabby realizes maybe she didn't have the brightest idea if this was going to hurt Grace and Carmen so much. So she has Carmen answer the door and claim to be Gabby Solis so that it will cover for all of them and Carmen won't be in trouble. But it's way too close a call because now they're really going to be suspicious of the Solis household and Carmen and Grace. They really have no choice but to go move in with family in Texas now. The two families say goodbye to one another, with Carmen and Gabby thanking each other for looking after their daughter. On to the Scavo storyline, which had me LOL and then had me serious. Susan walks in on Tom and Lynette having sex. Later, she asks Lynette why Lynette never told her that Tom has a big dick. Tom is upset to discover that Lynette never told anyone that he has a big dick. This tension builds between them throughout the week until it comes to a tipping point when Lynette confesses that every woman on the street is always talking about what an amazing, great, perfect husband Tom is, and that if she just added something to that list that was so private, then it would be like she was just reminding everyone how she didn't deserve him. The Scavos are truly stressing me the fuck out, and we're not even halfway into season 7. This whole plot is so stupid. I'm sorry, but I'm so tired. Anyone love this plot? Let me know in the comments. In this episode, let's move on, okay? We're barely moving on because in this episode, Renee tells Susan that there was a man in her past who was so good and kind to her, and she thinks that this man might be the love of her life. Susan tells her to never give up because you never know what could happen. Renee, once she is a little more drunk, confesses that the man is Tom Scavo. Bree and Keith continue to date, and later on, Keith's father makes a move on Bree. Now, if this was true soap opera territory, in my opinion, Bree should have slept with him. That's what would have happened on Melrose Place anyway. Okay, we are starting to slowly approach the climax of the Paul storyline. So, Paul buys another home on Wisteria Lane from an old man, and he tells him that it's great that he's getting out while he can because the neighborhood is about to change for the worse. With this house secure, Paul now feels ready to reveal to everyone what his big plan is. He is going to open a community house / transitional house on Wisteria Lane. So this is where people who are formerly convicted will come after they are let out of prison and start to rebuild their lives. Bob tells Paul that he can't just open the community house because HOA has the right to a vote. And turns out this is why Paul has been buying so many houses, because when the preliminary vote happens with the homeowners association, Paul owns half of the houses. So he's like one house away from getting to do whatever he wants. Everyone starts to turn on Lee for selling Paul all these houses without actually questioning why he wanted to buy so many. And Lynette says, "We are not going to let you tear this neighborhood apart." And Paul says, "You'll do it yourselves." So that really is Paul's plan. He's not trying to ruin the neighborhood by installing a halfway house. He just wants everyone to turn on each other. Season 7, episode 10. This is actually the season's event episode. We have a little bit of setup to get through first, so we're going to start with that. Gabby decides to go over and tell Lynette about what happened with Grace and Carmen. She wants some advice from her because Lynette is the only other woman she knows who has lost a child, and she thinks she might be able to find some helpful advice. Lynette suggests that she write Grace a letter, not one to be mailed, but just something to let all of her feelings out. So Gabby takes the advice and writes a letter to Grace. While playing dress up, Juanita finds the letter and reads it. When Gabby joins her on the couch, Juanita reveals that she knows the truth, that Grace is her biological daughter. Juanita accuses Gabby of loving Grace more than she loves her, and when Gabby tries to embrace Juanita, she says, "You're not my mommy," and pushes her away, then runs out of the house. For Bree, Keith proposes. Bree tells him it's too soon to be engaged, but she would love if he'd move in with her, so the pair decide to move in together. Keith's father stops by, and he kisses Bree. She pushes him away and gets him to leave. Then she calls Keith and tells him to come over because something happened with his father, and Keith goes outside, drags his father out of the car, and starts to beat him up. A bunch of guys oversee this, and thinking Keith is an ex-con, decide to start beating him up. Over Skype, Susan tells Mike about the Renee and Tom situation. She's not really sure whether or not she should tell Lynette. She decides to just tell Tom that she knows about Renee and Tom. This makes Tom go confront Renee, and it appears he asks her to leave. The halfway house is under construction with a bunch of ex-cons all coming together to help build the house. The homeowners association president of another street tells Lynette that they had a similar situation, and if they need anything at all, just let them know. The next vote is held, and Paul gets granted permission to do the halfway house. Lynette calls up this homeowners association president and says they want to do something like a protest. During the week, everyone continues to blame Lee for the whole situation since he is the one who sold Paul all the homes on Wisteria Lane. So Bob and Lee decide they need to leave town. They pack up their bags, head outside, and this is when all chaos begins to break loose. There are dozens and dozens of protesters on the street. They have all come out against the halfway house and are hoping that this protest will prevent it from happening. But really all it has done is cause complete disaster on Wisteria Lane. You may recall Juanita Solis ran out of the house just a few moments ago. Well, it was into this giant crowd who she has now been swarmed up in and pushed to who knows where. Likewise, Keith has just ran outside after his father and started to beat him up, and when all these men were already on the street, they thought that Keith was a con and go to beat him up. Bree runs outside with a gun and fires it into the air, and for a moment, everything is quiet, and then chaos hits once more. While the protesters are breaking things with golf clubs and bats and trampling each other, Bob and Lee think maybe they should go back inside. But then Juanita speaks up from the back seat and says, "Please don't leave me." So Lee crawls to the back to comfort Juanita, and the three of them sit in the back seat of the car together while this dangerous scene takes place around them. Susan ends up getting pushed to the ground and getting trampled, and Gabby puts herself in danger when she runs outside to try and find Juanita. She's able to get Juanita out of the car. Lynette rushes to Lee's rescue, shouting to everyone that he's her neighbor, thus preventing the crowd from attacking him as he gets out of the car. Police come to the scene, and eventually the protest is shut down. But at the end of the day, a lot of chaos was caused, including Susan being wheeled off to the hospital in an ambulance. The episode ends with Paul walking outside, happy with the result of his plans, until he gets shot. Paul collapses, and Mary Alice's voiceover suggests that he was shot as revenge. We don't know who fired the bullet yet, but because of it being revenge, it could be someone Felicia Tillman got to shoot him. It could be Beth. It could be somebody who was upset about the halfway house. So a new mystery is introduced. At this point in the season, the main mystery goes from what is Paul up to on Wisteria Lane to who shot Paul. As far as the event episodes go, I think this one is successful in a way different from the others. The season 3 episode Bang will always remain my favorite event episode, but what I like about this one is that instead of things coincidentally working out, such as in the tornado episode with Victor being killed, or with the conflict with Nora being taken care of in the episode Bang, this one is a little bit more organic, and it serves to better pace the overall Paul plot. Instead of the mystery being dragged out for a whole season, the event episode is a nice halfway point where we go from part A of the mystery to part B of the mystery, that being what is Paul up to, and now who shot Paul. Season 7, episode 11. An investigation begins into who shot Paul Young. Bree, of course, is taken into questioning because she had a gun out during the whole protest. She tells the officers that if she were aiming for Paul, he would be dead. Beth visits Felicia in prison and asks her who she hired to kill Paul, because this had to have been Felicia's doing. Felicia then calls someone and says, "Well, I guess you took me up on the offer." And it turns out to be Mike Delfino. As a reminder, Mike and Paul have had their fair share of issues over the years, most recently when Paul blackmailed Susan to try and get the house from them. But there's a lot more layers than that. One, Mike is Zach's biological father, and Paul was in on the murder of Mike's ex, so there has been 15 years of rivalry, although some of it he didn't have a face to associate it with. The detectives tell Paul and Beth that it seems Basically, everyone on Wisteria Lane had some sort of motive to shoot Paul, but all of them had alibis, so they want to continue the investigation a little further to see if they can find anything more specific. Mike visits Felicia in prison during this time and tells her that he was not the one who shot Paul and he doesn't know who did. And Paul, who is recovering in the hospital, gets another visit from the police who mention that Beth's mother is Felicia Tillman. It's important to note that she does not know that he knows. So in the riot, Susan's kidney was ruptured. She needs to begin dialysis and she is put on a transplant list because she needs a new kidney. However, she decides that she will try and push through and she wants to take MJ out for ice cream. So she gets out of her hospital bed and starts to walk down the hall, and then she collapses. Gabby and Carlos take Juanita to therapy to try and help her heal from the news that Grace is Gabby's biological daughter and she is Carmen's biological daughter. The therapist suggests that in order for Juanita to really begin to heal, they need to remove Grace from their lives. So this includes taking her drawings off the fridge, putting away all the pictures of her, and kind of pretending that Grace never really existed in their lives. And Gabby has a really difficult time doing this. And she wants to do something nice for Juanita, so the two of them go to a shop where they sell dolls, but Juanita doesn't want one. But Gabby decides to buy one for herself, and in fact, she buys one that looks a little bit too much like Grace. In the Scavo household, Susan tells Renee that she won't tell Lynette about what happened, but she thinks that Renee should tell Lynette. Renee first discusses it with Tom, who really doesn't want to tell Lynette, but during a business dinner, she decides to come clean to Lynette and tell her the full truth that she slept with Tom when Lynette and Tom were on a break. It was 20 years ago, and they were already engaged. Lynette asks Renee not to tell Tom that she knows. And finally, for Bree, in this episode, we get a surprise visit from Orson. Orson tells Bree that his girlfriend kicked him out and he has nowhere else to go. So Bree agrees that Orson can stay with her just temporarily until he finds somewhere to live. It turns out Orson did not get thrown out at all, but he just missed Bree and wanted her back, so that is why he came into town. Bree tells Orson that being with Keith has changed her in ways she can't even explain, and she no longer wants him. So Orson leaves. Bree then tackles Keith in the mud and kisses him. This is another huge indicator of how far Bree has come in her personal relationships. If you look at this scene compared to the scene where Bree is trying to make love with Rex but then can't because of the burrito on the nightstand, like, this is a whole new woman. Season 7, episode 12. Gabby continues to grow more and more attached to this doll that looks like Grace. I'm just gonna leave it there. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Lynette keeps pulling pranks on Tom to try and disrupt his day after learning the truth about Renee and Tom. When Renee tells Tom that Lynette knows about it, Tom and Lynette finally have an argument about this. Lynette says that all those years ago, when they were split up, Lynette spent a lot of the time thinking about her future with Tom, and as she tried to go about her everyday life while she was staying at her mom's, she couldn't imagine her life without Tom in it and didn't want a life without Tom in it. Meanwhile, Tom was off sleeping with her best friend. Tom tells Lynette that he has been wanting to tell her but just never found the right moment. And Lynette is understandably upset that in 20 years, he has never thought, maybe I should tell her. Tom ends by telling Lynette that it would be a shame if something that happened 20 years ago ruined the life that they had together. But the thing is, like, the whole thing is built on a lie, right? And the other thing, I understand why Lynette is mad at Tom. I don't understand why Lynette does not seem to care that it was Renee who did this to her. Because Lynette and Renee were best friends in college, right? I'm usually not one for blaming the other women. However, Renee knew damn well who Tom was. This was not an accident. This was not something that happened before Tom and Lynette were together. This was her best friend's fiance. And she slept with him. Where is the respect? Bree's pastor asks her to talk to Beth because he knows that she's having a rough time. Bree initially refuses, but after the pastor brings up that she is having premarital sex and sinning in all kinds of ways, Bree agrees to help her. So she goes over to see Beth and have a conversation with her and see what she can do to help. Bree invites Beth over for a girls' night. On the night that Beth is going to come over with the women, Bree receives a flower delivery. We assume they are from Keith, but later find out they were not from him at all, and we have no idea who they came from. The night ends up being super awkward, and they have nothing to talk about because none of them know Beth very well. But Bree agreed to do this for her pastor, so she drags the other women into the kitchen and tells them that she doesn't want Beth to end up like Mary Alice, so they all need to get it together and do something to support her. Back in the living room, Beth sits down and discovers that there is a gun under a pillow. It's the same type that the police say was used to kill Paul Young. Beth immediately grows suspicious that the women left her alone in the living room in order to get her fingerprints on the gun, and that one of them had actually fired the shot at Paul. Meanwhile, the other women say that Beth was alone in the living room for quite a while and may have planted the gun herself. That night, we see the man who delivered the flowers take off his baseball cap and wig and mustache, and it is revealed to be none other than Zach Young. Season 7, Episode 13. Mrs. McCluskey is the one who realizes first that Gabby has some sort of weird attachment to this doll that reminds her of Grace. She tells Carlos about it immediately, and he confronts Gabby about the doll. He suggests it has something to do with her feelings about Grace being gone from their lives, and Gabby says, no, it's nothing like that, and she yells that they are not supposed to talk about her. This is one of Eva Longoria's best scenes in season 7A, and it is followed by a Carlos and Gabby scene where they are going out to dinner, but they get jumped, and while being held at gunpoint to give over their car, Gabby starts screaming that she needs to get her baby out of the back seat. She can't unbuckle it, however, though, and the men are annoyed that she's trying to get a doll out of the back seat. They think it's some sort of trick and she's trying to get out of this carjacking. So when Carlos feels that they are in danger because of the guns that are present, he drags Gabby away from the car, and Gabby is left to scream over her baby being taken away from her. This scene almost perfectly parallels the scene from season 2 when Gabby and Carlos's to-be adopted child is taken away from them by its birth mother. Both episodes feature Eva Longoria giving a fantastic performance, and both highlight the loss that Gabby has faced. Likewise, just last episode, when Gabby was asking Lynette for a suggestion about how to approach this loss, it brings back up the miscarriage that Gabby had in early season 2 before she began to approach the whole adoption process. In this episode, Bob and Lee adopt a daughter. She's about Juanita's age, and they take her to go meet Renee first. And Lee asks Renee if she ever needs anything, can she go to Renee so that she kind of has a woman figure in her life who can help her out with things, and Renee agrees. A woman stops by the house and asks if Keith is there. When she discovers that Bree is Keith's girlfriend, not landlady, she gets upset and leaves. Bree knows the woman's name is Amber, so she wakes Keith up and tells him that he was mumbling about someone named Amber in his sleep. This leads Keith to confess that Amber is his ex-girlfriend. He explains that he loved her very much and that it was a long-term thing, and he loved her up until the day she left him. Bree goes to see Amber at her hotel and discovers that she has a child who is about 5 or 6 years old, and he is indeed Keith's child. Amber tells Bree she's not sure she should tell Keith about him, but she feels like she owes it to Charlie, so Bree tells her that she will take care of it and find out from Keith if he wants to be involved or not. At dinner, Bree brings up the idea of children again and asks Keith if he wants to be a father. He said that he used to, but then he met Bree and he's gotten used to the idea of maybe not having kids. So Bree decides not to tell Keith about Amber and Charlie being in town. Bree gives Amber a check, apologizes on Keith's and her behalf, and says that she wanted to make sure they did something for her and Charlie. Later, Bree is pruning her roses, and when Keith asks why everything is all messed up, Bree says that sometimes you have to hurt things to make them more beautiful. So Paul now knows that his whole marriage has been a fraud, and Beth is Felicia Tillman's daughter. But what he doesn't know is how he will punish her. After thinking for a while, Paul decides that maybe he and Beth should take a little trip, and who knows what he will decide to do on this trip. They begin planning for it, and Beth leaves a note to the gardener to say they'll be at the cabin, and as they are planning to leave, the police come to the door with a gun. They ask Paul if he recognizes the weapon, and both us and Paul see the gun for the first time. The gun is the one that Mary Alice used to kill herself all those years ago. This is how Paul puts together that the person responsible for shooting him is his son, Zach. Paul decides to cancel the trip with Beth and tells her that she dodged a bullet. Season 7, episode 14. Gabby goes to therapy but is having a really hard time opening up about her childhood. So for the next week or so, every time she's going to therapy, she's actually just going to the spa, and Carlos is making all these arrangements so that Gabby can go to therapy 3 times a week. Eventually, Carlos goes with her to therapy to lend some extra support, and although it is really difficult for her, Gabby ends up opening up to the therapist about her past. Part of the conversation revolves around the abuse that Gabby faced at the hands of her stepfather. This is something that is talked about, I think, mid-season 1. As a child, Gabby was molested by her stepfather, Alejandro. The whole time, Carlos is holding her hand to support her, and this is among the healthiest the Solis marriage has ever been. Bree meets up with Amber one more time to give her a cashier's check, and while she is waiting with Charlie while Amber runs across to the bank, Keith shows up and gets to meet Charlie for the first time. He still has no idea who Charlie is, but the two bond right away, and he just thinks that this is another friend of Bree's son. Seeing the instant connection that Keith had with this kid makes Bree decide to tell him the truth later on that day. Now that he knows that Paul was likely the one who shot him, Paul decides to find out where Zach is. So first he goes to the mansion where he knows Zach lived before, but the place has been foreclosed. So he consults the only person who might have a shot at helping him find his son, which would be Mike. Mike has no idea where Zach is, and Paul explains that it's important because the gun used to shoot him was Mary Alice's, and therefore it is probably Zach who did it. Mike says he really doesn't know where Zach is, but the last he heard, he was in Idaho. Paul tells Mike if he hears from Zach, let him know he knows what he did, and he's very disappointed. And then Mike calls Zach and tells him that Paul knows. We learn that Zach has been using hard drugs. In this case, he is using cocaine. And we get a brief flashback of Mike going to Zach to ask for help. This would have been right after Paul was let out of prison, when Mike and Susan were struggling the most for money. As you may recall, in season 2, Zach inherited all of his grandfather Noah's wealth, so he was like a multi-millionaire. Therefore, Mike goes to ask him for some money to help keep his family afloat. But Zach has already lost his fortune and is into hard drugs. Mike goes to Zach to confront him about shooting Paul, but also about his drug use. And remember, Mike is also an addict, so this is something that the two of them can relate to each other on, and something that Mike has experience working through. He really wants to help Zach. Zach's drug use in this episode is also another example of the cyclical trauma that we continue to investigate as the seasons go on in Desperate Housewives. Back in season 1, Deirdre was a drug addict, and that is why she gave up Zach, or Dana, in the first place. And so bringing it back in season 7 is yet another example of the ways that the two seasons parallel each other so nicely. Eventually, when Zach shows no sign of wanting to get better, Mike pulls the last string he can, which is bringing Paul over to speak to Zach as well. Season 7, episode 15. Carlos wants Gabby to follow her therapist's advice and go to a visit to her hometown to try and get some closure on her childhood trauma. So the two of them go together to her hometown, and everyone there recognizes Gabby. They all know her as the famous rich model who moved to New York and became a huge success. While in town, they visit Gabby's old school, and Gabby comes face to face with a nun who she knew when she attended school there. It turns out this is a nun who knew what Gabby's stepfather was doing to her, but neglected to help Gabby in any way. So instead of going to yell at her stepfather's grave, Gabby decides to confront this woman and get out some of her feelings to someone who was still alive, who could have helped her, but let her remain powerless. For Bree in this episode, Keith is continuing to get to know Charlie, and the two are getting more close. He's upset that Bree lied and didn't tell him the truth about Charlie earlier, but he thinks it's something that he and Bree will be able to move past and that their relationship will heal just fine. However, Keith tells Bree that he wants to move to Florida so he can be close to Charlie. That is not in the cards for Bree, and it's not even something she would consider. After thinking about it for a while, Bree tells Keith that he should follow his heart and become a father and move to Florida. So the two of them break up and Keith leaves. In this episode, Bree begins wearing all black again, which is something that she did after Rex passed away. As you may recall, the first time she breaks out of the black is when George dies. She wears white to the event that takes place on that night. So for those whole 12 episodes, she is dressed in black in her mourning attire, and once again, she is mourning here. Notably, this is not something that happened when Carl died. She continued dressing just like herself. For Susan in this episode, her health continues to deteriorate, and when she and Renee go out to lunch, Susan collapses. It is crucial that she get a kidney as soon as possible or she will not live much longer. Julie ends up calling her mother, but her mom is sick and therefore can't donate a kidney. And finally, back to Paul and Mike, the two of them decide to take Zach to rehab. They really give him two options. He can either go to jail for shooting Paul or he can go to rehab, and so Zach gets taken to rehab. Paul does ask Zach during this car ride why he shot him, and Zach says it's because he hates him. Zach blames Paul for everything that has gone wrong in his life. Fairly reasonable since he and Mary Alice are the ones who covered up the murder of his mother. But Zach has held a grudge all of this time. I believe this is the first time we see Zach since the time jump. So this seems like a natural progression of what may have happened in the last 7 or so years since we last saw Zach. When Paul gets home from dropping Zach off, he tells Beth that he wants her to leave. He kicks her out, saying he knows who she is. She begs him to stay, explains her new loyalties, that she does not care anymore about her mother Felicia, but instead she loves Paul, to which Paul replies that no one could ever love him. Season 7, Episode 16. Susan and Mike have an anniversary picnic. It is not yet their anniversary, but Susan thinks that she's not going to live long enough to actually celebrate the real date. They also renew their vows, which is a little silly because they celebrate it as their 8th anniversary, but they were divorced in there, so I don't really know what's going on. I don't know if they forgot that they just got remarried, but Bree hosts a party at her home where a nurse is brought in to test everyone to see if they are the right blood type to donate a kidney to Susan. There end up being 2 matches, Bree and Beth. Speaking of Beth, she's pretending that Paul never really threw her out and that she still lives there. No big deal. She tells Paul, and I want to quote this from my notes, she knows that Felicia telling her Paul killed Martha was a lie. She tells Paul she knows that Felicia telling her Paul. Okay, so Beth is telling Paul she doesn't believe her mother and she thinks Paul is innocent and did not kill Martha. Then Paul says, "Oh, Beth, that was no lie." Beth goes to her mother and tells her that Paul found out about her and that he no longer loves her, therefore ruining any chance of getting close to Paul in order to then hurt him, right? Felicia tells Beth that she is no longer welcome in her life because she's failed and that she's useless at everything she has ever done. Therefore, when Bree approaches Beth and tells her that she is a match for the kidney donation, Beth is over the moon. She's fully prepared to donate her kidney in order to do something important in her life. But Bree has just lost the only thing she had since losing her company, so it's really important to her that she be the one to donate. However, Beth has her mind set on this, so she takes the donation forms to the emergency room, and the woman at the desk redirects her to the 4th floor, which is the transplant wing. Beth just asks that the paperwork be taken care of downstairs, and then she pulls out a gun from her purse and shoots herself in the head. Paul's lore is kind of crazy. He's had 2 wives now who have both shot themselves in the head. He has a son who hates him. He killed a woman. He buried another woman in a wooden toy chest. And then he went and dug up the wooden toy chest from the place where no one ever would have found it and moved it to a lake where it would probably float to the surface and be found. This man. The women are all stunned to find out that Beth is the donor and that she dropped off the papers and then shot herself. It's especially striking because just 3 or 4 episodes ago, Bree told the women that she didn't want Beth to end up like Mary Alice, and look what happened. Is it Paul's fault? I don't know. When Susan arrives and finds out that Beth is the donor, Paul tells her that he does not plan to shut off the machines. Mike considers entering some sort of legal battle with Paul, but Susan doesn't want any of that. It takes a conversation with Felicia Tillman for Paul to decide that he will take Beth off life support. Felicia Tillman explains that she just wants Beth to be able to rest now, So Paul reluctantly tells Susan that he will go and say goodbye to his wife, and then Susan can get her kidney. With Beth dead, Felicia Tillman gets out of prison on humanitarian release and smiles an evil little smile as she steps out a free woman. The time has come, and I can't believe we've gotten to episode 17 and only now someone has died. Isn't that kind of crazy? Technically, we did have a death, but I didn't go over that episode, but I guess just an FYI. Lynette's mom gets married to some guy and then he dies in like the same episode. So there you go. Fly high, Beth. You lived, you served kidney, and then you died. In this episode, Bree gets a call from Mrs. McCluskey saying that Andrew walked into her house and passed out on her couch. She is shocked to discover that Andrew is an alcoholic. Bree ends up taking him to an AA meeting where he does a share and just bitches about his mother the whole time. It's literally like a scene straight out of Mom on CBS. It's difficult for Bree to hear all of this, but on the other hand, she is also an alcoholic who has been through all of these meetings and knows how important it is. So Bree really does seem willing to put up with all of that if it means helping her son. Andrew also tells Bree that his husband left him because his drinking has gotten so bad. And so this is kind of a turning point for Andrew. And Bree at least has something new to do, kind of a little project helping her son. But the thing most noteworthy to me was how closely together we have this story with the Mike and Zach rehab story, and seeing it in different settings, different types of families is very interesting. Tom gets offered a new job from a friend he's playing golf with, and he considers taking it, but he doesn't want to screw Carlos over. Lynette really wants him to take it though because the job would pay a lot more, it's a better position, and it would be good for the family and for Tom's career. So when Tom tells Carlos about the job offer, Carlos decides to offer him a meaningless title change and a very small raise and like a cut of the bonuses at the end of the year. But the thing is, there are no bonuses at the end of the year. So Lynette is mad that Tom got swindled into this deal by Carlos. After some further manipulation from Lynette and her pulling some strings, Tom decides he is going to take the higher paying job at the other company. During this same week, Renee happens to be throwing a huge party. The women begin to question if that's still in good taste, with Beth having just passed, and Renee says, and I quote, "My social life is not going to stop just because some cuckoo cleaned out her ears with a handgun." So she still has the party, and she tells Gabby that what Beth did was selfish, and we start to get an inkling that maybe she's projecting about something. And we do indeed get confirmation that when Renee was younger, her mother took her own life. She opens up to Gabby about this, but says she doesn't want to talk about it any more than that. Season 7, episode 18. The new job that Tom takes means that he's not spending as much time with Lynette and begins to add some conflict to their marriage, which is not really something the Scavo marriage needed. Let's just say that. As part of AA, Andrew needs to make amends with some people in his life, and to him, this includes coming clean to the Solis family about accidentally killing Juanita Solis. He warns Bree that he's going to tell Carlos, and Bree is like, let's not do that. But then we find out that Andrew and Carlos have gone on a camping trip together. So Gabby and Bree hurry up to try and save Andrew from Carlos's wrath. But when they get there, it turns out that Andrew did not actually tell Carlos yet about hitting Juanita Solis with a car when he was drunk. The truth comes out, and Carlos is furious that Gabby never told him once Bree told her. Andrew vows to Carlos that he will make things right no matter what it takes. And Carlos tells Bree and Gabby that the two of them are forbidden from seeing one another anymore. So, following Beth's passing, Felicia actually gets possession of one of the homes on Wisteria Lane. It's actually Catherine's old house. This is because all of Beth's possessions went to Felicia, and this house was in Beth's name. So, as a resident of Wisteria Lane once again, Felicia asks Paul to help her scatter Beth's ashes at a lake that Beth loves. She wants Paul there because Beth loved him, but also because she doesn't have a car, so she can't drive herself to the lake. While in the car, Felicia admits out loud that she acknowledges it was Martha Huber who drove Mary Alice to kill herself, but Paul will not admit to killing Martha Huber. Felicia is really just trying to get a confession on tape, but Paul brought a gun with him. Felicia manages to get it away from him by the time they reach the lake, and she threatens to shoot him, saying that she could end all of this now. She says that she could shoot him and claim self-defense and end all of this now, but she tosses the gun into the water instead and dumps Beth's ashes. However, when we get home, we see that what she dumped were not Beth's real ashes, but like fireplace sweepings, and in fact, Beth's real ashes are still at home with Felicia, and she promises Beth, literally to her ashes, that this is not over, that she will get the revenge she needs, that she will make this right, etc., in her typical Felicia Tillman fashion. Season 7, episode 19. Gabby tells Carlos that he can't stop her from seeing Bree, and the two of them enter a little affair era. The two of them are sneaking around, taking private phone calls, doing everything they can to make sure Carlos doesn't know that the two of them are seeing each other. They even discuss what a thrill it is for the two of them to be sneaking around, and Bree compares it to the excitement that she used to get when she met Carl up at the motel. And Gabby is like, should we do that? And Bree is like, okay. And it takes a second for them to be like, well, just the sneaking around part, like not the sex part. And the two are literally so flirty with each other in this scene. I just know that Marcia Cross and Eva Longoria had an amazing time filming this scene, and it's so funny. Their chemistry breeds so well on the screen and really makes this whole plot work. I feel like if it were any combination of the other women, it just wouldn't come across as well. But because the chemistry is there, it's so funny, and it balances the stakes of what's happening so nicely. Eventually, Carlos discovers that the two of them have still been hanging out together. He tells Gabby that she has to choose. It's either him or Bree. And that's how Gabby ends up showing up on Bree's doorstep with the girls and asking if she can stay with her. I love women. Okay, over to the Scavos. You are not gonna fucking believe this. They have another fight in which Tom says that Lynette will not allow herself to take the back seat while Tom steers the ship. Riveting stuff, never heard before. He specifically says that he can't believe that after all the years that she put her career first, that she can't just take the back seat for once and be happy for him. I'm sorry. What about the fucking pizza parlor y'all ran for 6 years and then dumped when you got bored? What about her getting pregnant and then giving you her job, which you have worked since? What about all the years when she was raising the kids before she decided to go back to work in season 2? I think out of their 20-year marriage, she has worked 5, 6 of the years, plus the pizza parlor on top of that, which was Tom's idea and she helped him run. I'm sorry, Tom Scavo needs to get a fucking grip. I'm gonna move on before I have an aneurysm or something. It just gets worse and worse though, because in this episode, Susan is struggling after surgery because she hasn't been able to have sex in quite a while. She is so full of lust, in fact, that she has a sex dream about Paul Young. Listen, a Susan sex dream scene is traumatizing enough, but make it about Paul Young. She decides to take this as an indication that maybe she should go see how Paul is doing, that she's feeling some guilt for Beth passing away and getting a kidney to her because of how much pain it's caused Paul. So she decides to go over and see how he's doing, and unfortunately he's really not doing very well. She ends up making dinner for him and they have a meal together, and initially Mike is upset about this, because again, there's just so much friction between Mike and Paul and Zach. But he comes to forgive Susan and embrace it because it's a reflection of how kind Susan really is. And this episode is well enough written where I agree and I'm willing to accept this about Susan. In the earlier seasons, when yeah, she's well-meaning, but she keeps fucking things up, it's never really likable to me. For one reason or another, this specific story lands and I see where Susan's coming from and I'm able to think she's coming to a reasonable decision given her personality and the way she views other people and whatnot. We have a little more Felicia content. She stops by Karen McCluskey's and gives her a brooch that used to belong to her sister Martha. And then she thanks her for helping her that night and for keeping her secret for all of those years. We then get a flashback and see that the night Felicia took off after chopping off 2 of her fingers to fake her own death, she ran into Karen and made Karen promise not to tell anyone that she saw her. Felicia then tells Karen that she had a daughter named Beth and that she killed herself and that Paul is the reason why. So the seeds have continued to be planted for some sort of revenge from Felicia Tillman. Season 7, episode 20. After a disagreement about the decoration in his office, Lynette and Tom have yet another fight. Meanwhile, Bree is sick of the girls ruining her perfect, beautiful household, so she's beginning to get a little frazzled. She yells at a man whose car is parked and blocking her driveway, and he turns out to be a detective, Chuck, pictured here. I lied, pictured here. This is Chuck. Juanita is curious about why Carlos is so mad, and he ends up telling her the truth, or a version of it. Juanita passes this on to Celia and says, "You know what Dad just told me? Bree killed Grandma." This results in the police being called, and Chuck is the one to come over to investigate. They're able to pass off the whole thing as a misunderstanding, and Chuck gives Bree his number. Susan finds out that Beth is Felicia's daughter and that Felicia is out of prison because of Beth's passing. Felicia stops by Susan's once she finds out that Susan is cooking for Paul. Susan is making a few meals a week for Paul and bringing them over so that he doesn't have to worry about feeding himself. She begins distracting Susan whenever she's coming home with groceries so that she can dose the ingredients with antifreeze in order to slowly poison Paul. And so as the weeks go on and Susan continues to feed Paul, his health begins to decline. Mike tells Susan that they now have the money to move back into their home, so it's time for her to talk to Paul about moving out. As soon as Susan brings up the idea of moving back in, Paul begins to suspect that the only reason she was ever being nice to him in the first place was so that she could have her house back. And at the end of the episode, Paul, with his health continuing to get worse because of the antifreeze from Felicia, collapses. Season 7, episode 21. Juanita is scared after watching a horror movie with Gabby. She comes into her parents' room in the middle of the night and says that there is the creepy killer man on their lawn. In order to help Juanita get over this fear, Gabby suggests that Juanita and Carlos sleep outside in a tent overnight so that they can see there's nothing to be scared of. Carlos refuses to do this though, so Gabby is the one to spend the night with Juanita in a tent. At one point during the night, Lee scares them for fun and has a good laugh with Juanita, and Juanita begins to see there's really nothing to be scared of. Later, there is a shadow looming over the tent. Gabby assumes once again that it is Lee, but as the figure walks away, the camera zooms out and we see that it is not Lee, but a mysterious man watching over Gabby. In the Scavo household, things kick off when Tom books a vacation for the family without consulting Lynette first. This episode holds the Tom and Lynette fight of the season. Tom says, "You can't handle my success," to which Lynette replies, "You can't handle it. You've turned into a pompous ass." To which Tom replies, "You've turned into a raging bitch." And the camera cuts to Penny, who is standing on the stairs having overheard the last minute of this conversation, sobbing. Later that night, Lynette tells Tom that Penny is still upset because she assumes her parents are going to get divorced, and a lot of her friends' parents are getting divorced, so she wouldn't see why this would be any different. Lynette tells Tom that she knows the two of them have always fought, but not like this, and something needs to change. So the two of them agree that they're going to take a weekend trip together to have some time alone to try and work out this situation. Tom and Lynette have me stressed as fuck this season. Renee, being the resourceful woman she is, decides to run a background check on Chuck prior to his date with Bree. Bree thinks that Renee is just trying to sabotage her. Maybe she's still upset about the whole Keith thing, but Renee is just looking out for her friend. And a good thing too, because it turns out Chuck is married. Bree confronts him about this, and he explains that he is separated and dating. And he brings up her baggage, including Orson and even George. Of course, Bree ends the date there and demands that he take her home, but the next day she decides to give him another chance and asks him out to lunch. On to Paul. The doctor tells Paul he thinks his symptoms are probably just stress-related, unless somebody's poisoning him or something. So Paul begins to suspect that Susan is poisoning him, and that this whole thing of being kind to him was just a ploy to get in so that she could hurt Paul. Paul gets a lab to test a casserole that Susan made for him, and it comes back positive for antifreeze, which lines up with all of his symptoms. Meanwhile, Susan is trying to get her job back at the school, and when she shows up around a fundraiser to talk to a mom about possibly getting the job back, a mom sees the cookies sitting in the back seat, which she is taking to Paul, and assumes that they are for the fundraiser. Now, since Susan is trying to get back into their good graces, she says, yeah, those are all for you. And they are taken to the fundraiser. She then drops off a lasagna to Paul, who confronts her about poisoning his food. And now it clicks. The cookies that were just left at the school contain antifreeze. So Susan rushes to the school. Shortly after, police arrive and take her into custody for questioning in a possible poisoning attempt against Paul. We are rapidly approaching the end of the season. Mysterious man haunting Gabby. We've got the Delfino Meyer family trying to move back into their home. Felicia getting closer to getting justice in the case of the murder of her sister. The Scavo marriage on the rocks once again. Season 7, episode 22. Gabby finally sees the mysterious man outside, and he seems to be stalking her. She decides to ask Bree for a gun because she's scared. She discovers that the man following her is her stepfather, who she presumed to be dead. The return of Alejandro is a certified soap trope moment. However, what makes this extraordinary writing is the fact that we had 2 episodes introducing the idea of her father once again. Some soaps would just pull him out of thin air, but this one actually uses a character who was already introduced all the way in season 1. But in this season, we had both Gabby in therapy discussing what he did to her, as well as a visit to her hometown. Just to make sure we are all on the same page, it's this visit to her hometown that alerted Alejandro to the fact that Gabby was still alive and around, and that she was going around to her old school spreading rumors about him. So once we put 2 and 2 together, it makes sense why he would reappear after all this time. Gabby continues training with a gun at a gun range, seemingly ready to kill him if he ever comes near her again. Tom and Lynette continue to make me feel physically ill as they go on their weekend trip and have nothing to talk about. They try to have a discussion, but they just don't even know where to start. Lynette says, "We have survived 5 kids, a failed restaurant, and cancer. Why can't we pull out of this?" Tom says, "I don't know what you want. I don't know what I want. I just know it isn't this." Ever since he called her a raging bitch in the last episode, I'm just like... After dinner at Bree's, she and Chuck kiss, and he tells her that he wants to wait to have sex with her until his divorce is finalized. Bree is a little disappointed, like she was definitely ready to just go for it that night, but she respects his decision. Meanwhile, across town, Susan is questioned by police. They find syringes and antifreeze behind Susan's apartment, and Mike tells police that while Felicia Tillman was in prison, she offered Mike $10,000 to kill him. Mike then goes over to talk to Paul and reveals to him that it was Felicia who tried to kill him. They go over to confront Felicia together, but she's already left the lane. Paul then tells Susan that he's also ready to leave and Susan can have her own home back. And he seems genuinely sweet to her here, like he's ready to put all of this behind him now that Felicia is out of his life again. And then Paul walks up to the house and he is hit on the head by Felicia Tillman, which knocks him out. When he wakes up, he's been bound to a chair by Felicia, and he is receiving an IV that will kill him. Remember, Felicia is a nurse, so she definitely knows what she's doing, and Paul is kind of fucked. He admits out loud to Felicia that he wasn't sorry for killing Martha Huber, and he still isn't sorry for killing Martha Huber. This is a confession that Felicia gets on tape. Susan happens to come back by the house because she wants MJ's room to be all ready for him when they move back in. She gets there and overhears Paul and Felicia chatting, and she ends up calling the police. And then, in order to save a little bit of time and get to Paul faster, she uses MJ's little police car toy to make a siren sound that will scare Felicia off. So Felicia runs outside to flee. And this buys Susan a few seconds to help Paul break free from the ties, but not enough time to prevent Felicia from coming back inside once she's realized she's been played. There is a fight between Paul and Susan and Felicia. Susan is almost stabbed with a syringe in what would presumably be a fatal dose, and Paul almost starts choking Felicia out. Luckily, Susan stops him by saying, "You are not like her. You are not a killer." Paul releases Felicia from his grasp and lets her go. She grabs Beth's ashes and flees. Susan helps Paul to the front door as the ambulance and police begin to arrive outside. She tells Paul that she knew he wouldn't kill Felicia, but Paul says that Felicia was right. He did kill Martha Huber. As they greet the police officers standing outside, Paul tells them he has something to confess. Felicia begins her getaway. As she's driving away, she bends over to grab something, and Beth's ashes fall from her lap. They spill everywhere, and the air conditioning in the car causes the ashes to fly in her face, which distracts her, and then she swerves into an oncoming truck, and her car is smashed, and we are left to assume that she is dead. They just couldn't handle her. I don't know. I miss her already. Season 7, Episode 23, the finale of Season 7. Susan is welcomed back onto Wisteria Lane with a progressive dinner party, which is a dinner party in which each course takes place at someone else's house, so you will move along the street as the night goes on. Gabby confronts her stepfather when he's alone in town, and he explains that he became interested in finding her following her trip to her hometown. She's got a gun, and she makes him get on his knees, and she kicks him around. This scene is probably in the top 5 of Eva Longoria's performance on this entire show. And this scene is so crucial for what will become the most important thing to carry the rest of the series. Anyway, Gabby tells him to leave and to never come back again and to go back to being dead. And once he drives away, she vomits in the grass. Carlos finds the gun while Gabby is getting ready for dinner, and this is when she is finally able to tell him that Alejandro is back in her life. Meanwhile, for the Scavos, Tom suggests that he move into an apartment owned by the company across town so that he and Lynette can have a little bit of space while they try to work things out. Lynette is terrified by the idea, and she doesn't want him to go because once he walks out that door, she assumes he will never come back. While Lynette is in the shower, Tom has stepped out of the house, and the suitcase that was kept in the corner of the room from their weekend trip is now gone, which makes Lynette assume he has left. So when she joins Susan at the party, she tells her that Tom left her. As the cocktail hour at Renee's house comes to an end, Lynette goes back home to her house to prepare salad for the salad course. Tom is standing in the kitchen, and he explains that he was going to leave, but he just couldn't do it like that. Lynette cries and tells Tom him leaving her is the worst thing she could ever imagine. But when she saw the suitcase was gone, she was relieved. She was relieved. I am a child of divorce. By the time the dinner course comes around, Bree and Chuck have had sex, and they are clearly all over each other, and clothes are a mess. And everyone arrives and there's no chicken for them to eat. So they're like, we're gonna go to the store. You guys hang out. We'll be back. So that's where Bree and Chuck's relationship ends up by the end of the episode. But the real drama of the evening occurs when Gabby steps home to start preparing the dessert course. Alejandro is there waiting for her. What follows is some of the most disturbing dialogue I've ever seen on network television. Alejandro pats his shirt and says that he has Gabby's gun, so she no longer has anything to defend herself with. Earlier, out in the grass where Gabby confronted Alejandro, one of the things she told him was that before he molested her, she was a virgin. And now Alejandro says, when you said that thing about being a virgin, I almost had to laugh. And he goes on to shame her for wearing short skirts and dressing to seduce him as a 15-year-old, and just some of the most disgusting dialogue about her enjoying what they shared. And it's pretty clear he intends to assault her again. And this is when Carlos arrives home and whacks Alejandro on the head with a candlestick. Alejandro is knocked unconscious on the ground. And it turns out he's dead. Gabby tells Carlos, it's okay, it was self-defense, he has my gun. And Carlos starts searching, and the gun is not on him. The gun has been in the safe the whole time, but Alejandro said that to scare her. This is when Bree enters the Solis household, followed by Susan and Lynette. The three women soon realize exactly what happened, that Carlos killed Alejandro, who is now lying on the floor in front of them in the living room. Gabby is beginning to panic because Carlos will go to jail for killing an unarmed man, but Bree says she will not allow that to happen. And she begins to mastermind a plan. And what is so good about this scene is that for the past half a season or so, there has been tension between Carlos and Bree over what she did with Andrew, right? And now the time has come where it's not just, oh, he can forgive her, he'll forget about it, he'll move on. But the exact things that she did, 9 years ago, is exactly the kind of support that Gabby needs now. Bree has no hesitation about doing something like this for Gabby. I think the last handful of episodes have shown just how close these two women are, and all of the women. One of the most stressful parts about the immediate cover-up that needs to happen is there is a whole party of people now walking down Wisteria Lane towards the Solis house, including a detective who Bree is dating. That is why the introduction of Chuck is so important to happen at the time it did. It gave us just enough episodes to make it clear that Bree is entangled with the detective, but also now involved in this huge cover-up of a murder. Mary Alice's monologue at the end implies that Carlos has now forgiven Bree for what happened with his mom, and that Alejandro's body is now stuffed into the trunk in the middle of the Solis living room, where a dinner party will now take place. And that is where season 7 ends. We have a lot to work out in our final season, starting with the obvious murder. You'll see why it's trees later, okay? Let me cook. As you may have guessed by now, this central thing will be the murder of Alejandro. For season 8, episode 1, I will add lines to connect who already knows about the said murder, who's involved in the cover-up. And then as the season progresses, I will add things that are crucial about the murder to this space here. Instead of connecting like Bree to Carlos, because he's the one who did the killing, I'm just going to connect everyone to the murder itself. I just want to lay that out now so we kind of have a framework, if you will, of where we are headed with the final season. We also have the Scavo family in shambles. Susan and Mike returning to a little bit of normalcy by moving into their regular home. And then those who are most closely tied to the murder being the Solis family and Bree. Season 7 has already accomplished a lot of the work that needs to be done in wrapping up the series. Bringing back so many characters from the early seasons like Paul, Zach, and Felicia gives a sense of closure to all that has happened on Wisteria Lane, and it leaves room for this final stretch of thriller/drama to be played out without needing to return to the same mysteries that we have had for the whole series. It's going to give us a better payoff for all of the individual character arcs and overall themes of the series if we don't have to focus on a small mystery or 2 or 3 small mysteries like we have in earlier seasons. So season 7 really is the conclusion of all of those mysteries, and it gets resolved pretty early in the season, I would say, especially because the question of who killed Paul doesn't last very long. By the time we get to the end of the season, the question is more about who is stalking Gabby, which of course catapults us into the central plot for season 8. Some other full circle moments include the Solis family finding out about Andrew being the one to hit Juanita, the return of Alejandro, which, by the way, honestly, the introduction of Renee Perry and having the brief love triangle of Bree, Renee, and as I talked about before, her moving into Edie's old house just makes sense. We also have the 2 plots that mirror one another, which I mentioned briefly before, which is both Bree and Andrew's shared addiction and Mike and Zach's shared addiction. We have the parallels of Gabby losing children in seasons 1 and 2 to Gabby losing Grace. We have conflicts in the Scavo marriage that have been present since season 1, but seem to be pushed aside every single time, or they overcome it every time, usually because of a crisis. But now the marriage itself is the crisis. As mentioned before, this season's event episode didn't give a convenient way out for all of these plots. No characters were killed in the process. No characters were rescued from their conflicts by the antagonist in their story being killed off in the event episode. Instead, the biggest example of a crisis resolving a conflict would be when Bree steps up to be the one to organize the cover-up of Alejandro's murder, which of course resolves the ongoing tension between the Solis family and the Van de Kamp family. We also have a Bree who has turned down Orson, thus refusing to go back into her past self, sacrificing a man she loved and relationship she was comfortable with and could plan a future with in order for him to be happy and achieve the things that he wants in life. And this all makes the space for Bree to step up alone as a confident woman who is ready to help her friend in a crisis. A crisis which we will continue to explore through all of season 8. This season was not quite as deadly as others, but I will tell you, in season 8, 3 of the characters who are currently alive on the wall will be with us no longer. For all of these reasons, to me, season 7 is the strongest the show has been since probably early season 4. I think it's at its strongest when the mysteries are bound by character. There is not as much excess in this season as there are in seasons such as 5. Although the main mystery surrounding Paul is resolved before the midpoint of the season, we never feel like anything is excess, perhaps because so much of it is built on things that we have seen already in earlier seasons. Whereas with the Dave storyline in season 5, which you'll recall is all based around a car accident that Mike and Susan were in, we never see the car accident until the 5th season. So it never really reaches a level of depth. Maybe because I'm not super invested in Mike and Susan as a couple, whereas if I were, then knowing that the accident is what broke them up might be enough to really get me to be invested in it, or at least for the payoff to feel more rewarding. This time, the payoff feels so rewarding even though it's early on, simply because we have been familiar with the Young family ever since season 1, and Mary Alice has been present in almost every single episode since the pilot. And I think that's all I have to say. So this concludes my season 7 recap. If you're enjoying the series so far, be sure you hit the like button down below and subscribe so you don't miss season 8, which is the final season of Desperate Housewives, as soon as I post it. If you want to support the channel, you can do so via Ko-fi, link down in my description, or by leaving a super comment on YouTube. Season 8 video will be coming very soon, along with a playthrough of the Desperate Housewives PC game, where we will cause as much chaos in Wisteria Lane as we possibly can. That will do it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one. Bye!